Arc 6, The Corridor of Memories. Chapter 10, As if a flash. Jumbled together with the vast land of sand dunes, was a flower meadow with a variety of colors. It was nighttime, and mysteriously, the light of the stars in the sky of the sand dunes was not visible. The reason why the look of the sky could not be perceived despite there being no gathering of clouds was that the miasma enshrouding the space above ground covered this vast sea of sand, was the explanation given beforehand. It was not clear to Subaru whether the one to give that explanation had been Beatrice, or Amelia, or Julius. But now, what was clear was, rather than the imperceivable look of the sky, the alarm bell of caution directed from the ground, the ominous bloom of the flower meadow undefeated in front of the darkness of the night. The vivid, rather venomous flowers were, excessively mismatched in the sea of sand. Subaru, the sand dunes, flower meadow. Sensing the unsettling feeling while voicing it as well as he pronounced that word, there, Subaru had already been aware. Emerging at the back of his mind, was the information gathered in the bar of Myrula. The bartender there, who had lost one of his legs, had spoken of the flower meadows that appear in the sand dunes. If flower meadows are spotted in the sand dunes, run away at full speed, is what he had said. Because those are the turfs of the ferocious, ugly witch beasts, courtesan bears. Subaru, but even if you say run away at full speed. Pointing out the weakness in those words, the muttering Subaru, while gazing ahead, stepped back. The flower meadow was the territory of a witch beast, that information was beneficial. There was also the mention of immediately running from the, henceforth, ferocious and atrocious witch beast. But if there was a problem, it was its scale. Keeping their silence, Subaru and the others, who were lined up in a row, held their breaths. In front of the row, having surmounted the menace of sandtime, broken through the distortion of space, what had appeared was the continuous desert leading to the watchtower. Those lines of sight were now filled with the stretching flower meadow. It was, quite literally, dense enough for there to not be a single spot to step on. Springing forth all of a sudden in the desert, was the paradise of the flower meadow. There were limits even when it came to shoddiness. It was something that they would have avoided even without the warning of the bar's bartender. That is precisely why, if flying through the sky was an option, then they would have had chosen that and avoided this without any hesitation whatsoever. Subaru, avoiding it, is impossible, you know. Murmuring it such that there was no difference between it and a hoarse sigh, Subaru aimed his voice towards Meili. Under the present conditions, regarding their countermeasures against witch beasts, relying on Meili was of an unexpected benefit. What she judged controlled their path, but the complexion of her face, glaring at the flower meadow, was quite pale. With the formation of cold sweat, blood vanished from her light-complexioned skin. Without the need of any words, she understood the negativity of the emergency, as if having picked it up with her own hands. Slowly, Patrash, with her large build, drew closer with unbelievable silence. On her back was Beatrice, seeing the instruction in her eyes saying jump on. In fact, Subaru placed his foot on the saddle, and while doing so, silenced all sound and once again positioned himself on top of the dragon. Whether it was for continuing ahead, or for returning back, it would not be possible for Subaru's legs, who would get swallowed by the sand. Even if their judgments were made through the reins, they would have to rely upon the well-walking legs of Patrash for fast movement. Meili, for now, it seems everyone is sleeping. Holding his breath, how much time had it been since Meili's judgment had been awaited? As if 10 seconds had passed, or to him it felt like it had been nearly an hour, Meili spilled that out, as if whispering. Receiving that, Subaru, with energy draining from his shoulders, brought Patrash closer to the dragon carriage. Subaru, that flower meadow is the turf of the courtesan bear. That would be correct, right? Julius, in addition to the received prior information, for now that doesn't seem to be wrong. But it is just that, the scale is larger than what even I had thought. Beatrice, that difference in scale, is addition of something as cute as it being twice or thrice, I suppose. Letting out a single sigh, Subaru and the rest, facing each other, exchanged their thoughts. Julius and Beatrice too, at the great reception surpassing their expectations, were in a state of having lost their voices. The ones inside the dragon carriage, Amelia and the rest, their voices of delight after having broken through sandtime too, had come to a halt, as they were showing their faces through the small window, wondering what had occurred. Amelia, Subaru, did something happen? The sound of the sand breeze can't be heard anymore. Subaru, we did a splendid job clearing sandtime. And, just when I thought we had cleared the first barrier, we're now standing, expecting the next, second barrier immediately. As you can see. Amelia, as you can see you say. Seeing the clearly visible flower meadow at a single glance, through the small window, Amelia's throat froze in shock. She had also heard what the bar's bartender had said. Of course, the information she recollected must also have been the same. Amelia repeatedly blinked her eyes, and beside her, Anastasia and Ram also showed their faces. The two also gazed at the flower meadow, and grimaced at the cruelty of the trials to reach the tower. Subaru, even after passing through the sand wind and sand time, the obstacle this time are the flower meadows, huh? Regarding the territory of these courtesan bears, does Anastasia happen to know something? Anastasia, Goaidin is my business, expecting anything more than that'd be a problem. That being said, this seriously is a bit of a problem. What should be done? Holding expectations from the opinion of the unexpressed Iridna, she, while shrugging her shoulders, did not seem to possess a plan to overcome the obstacle. Subaru let out a long breath from his nose and looked at Meili. Subaru, Meili, with your physical constitution, you can draw in the witch beasts, right? Courtesan bears too, can't you pull them out from the flower meadow? Meili, that's difficult. If it's 10, 20, or even if it's 100, I can, but a number more than that and there'll be some children to whom my instructions won't reach. Subaru, there's a limit to the number, huh? Meili, there's also a limit on the quality. Even I can't tell around the white whale or the great rabbit. The courtesan bear is at that point, its compatibility with me is bad. Very different from the shadow lion. Subaru, shadow lion. Ah, that large one who showed up at the mansion, right? Putting a limit to their conversation about old memories, Subaru considered Meili's opinion and glared at the flower meadow. Countless, a vast paradise of flowers just as expected, even the estimate of the number of which beasts could not be determined. But it was clear that it was easily more than 100, which was Meili's limit. Julius, in the present situation, it could be said that the choices we have are to either continue or return. Facing Subaru, who had drowned in silence, the driver Julius said that lifting two of his fingers and tilting his neck. Seeing Julius' fingers, Subaru inhaled. Subaru, the choice to return wasn't there from the beginning, you know. It'll be a waste after clearing sand time, but with that, nothing of the problem will get solved. Going ahead is meaningless too. Julius, if we get under a different sand time, or if we take a different path entirely, we may be able to challenge the watchtower. Putting a halt to consideration and plugging up its path, isn't that simply drawing a hasty conclusion? The sand time that occurred thrice in the day, amongst them lay the correct answer, and that was Julius' insistence. What Subaru and the others had escaped out from was the sand time of late night. Others were the sand time of morning and afternoon, but was it possible that the place that would be reached through would differ as different sand times were chosen? No, gesturing that, Subaru shook his head. Subaru, for argument's sake, even if a different path was to be taken, I don't think it can possibly guarantee the safety of the path all the way to the watchtower. Here are the flower meadows, but there's the possibility of there being a different obstacle someplace else. Probably, no enjoyable path has been arranged at all. Julius, certainly. Slightly, excessive hopeful observation, huh? Subaru, on top of that, possibly, the situation of Meili being there and the turf of the courtesan bears. This one is actually the best path, that's also a possibility, you know? Julius, this time, excessive pessimism, huh? As always, it is your forte to denounce and uplift, isn't it? Subaru, I don't remember ever aiming for that. All right then, Meili. What about you? Harshly telling Julius, who rounded his eyes at how unfavorable the situation was, Subaru turned towards Meili. Silent, gazing intently at the flower meadow, Meili, at Subaru's words, said with her gaze cast downwards. Meili, the number is painful, but if you tell me to do it then I'll try doing it. It's not like I have to listen to everything which all of the animal sands have to say. Subaru, you don't need to for everything you say. Meili, for passing through the flower meadow, it would be fine if just the minimum number of courtesan bears are quietly gotten rid of. If a path is opened up, for the rest I'll have them obediently sleep. If they're not attacked then it can be somehow managed with that. As if gaining certainty in her thoughts while answering the doubt, strength returned to Meili's voice. At the very least, she had a stance of respecting Subaru's chance of continuing. That was something to be genuinely grateful for. Subaru nodded to Meili, and then looked at everyone's faces. Subaru, I think we should continue. Regardless of what's chosen, there can be no return without jumping into the risk. It's about there being some solution to the problem rather than just running away from it. Ram, even though you rely on others to attain your own objectives, isn't that quite something to declare with that mouth? Ram fired bitter words at Subaru, who'd suggested to proceed. Receiving her typical words, Subaru let out an "oh" and raised his thumb. Subaru, ultimately, it's no mistake that we have to rely on Meili. By any chance, if it ends up being that we have to attack the witch beasts, then we'll have to rely on Emiliatan, or Julius, or Biko. How wicked. Subaru, oh, also, Patrash too. My bad, my bad. He caressed his beloved dragon's head, who'd raised her neck up as if discontent at having her name absent as one of the members he could rely on. Against that pathetic declaration of Subaru's, Ram, with a frankly astonished expression, shrugged her shoulders. Ram, having self-awareness will be of no help. At best, in that unlikely scenario, fulfill the role of a decoy. Subaru, hearing that, is also pretty nostalgic. You may not remember it though. At the words somewhat pertaining to the past, Ram made an anxious face. Those were words like those in the forest of the witch beasts, or on the morning of the day they headed out to the capital for the royal selection, which he had been slapped with by Ram. With Rem's existence disappearing from her memories, and accompanying memories altered, now, where must have the back and forth of that day vanished off to? Subaru, let's go, to take it back. I don't want to backtrack for even a second anymore. Emilia, I guess that's so. I also think it's just as Subaru says. At Subaru's decision, who hardened his fist, consented Emilia with a gallant expression. She touched the pendant on her neck and stole the feelings of the spirit sleeping within the great magic stone into her fingers. And her amethyst eyes earnestly focused on the flower meadow. Emilia, beyond this flower meadow, is the key to precious memories. Let's go without stopping. For sure, I will make sure to protect everyone. Anastasia, isn't it a bit too uncool coming from a girl? At Emilia's majestic declaration, Anastasia said that as she looked towards Subaru. Keep quiet, he wanted to return that as response, but the truth is, if it turns out just as how Emilia says, he thought that would be the best, as there would be nothing to worry about left. The distance till the Pleiades watchtower, gauged with his eyes, had roughly decreased several kilometers. Before crossing through Sandtime, when they had recklessly proceeded through the Augria sand dunes, the supposedly visible distance to the watchtower, seemingly of 10 kilometers, had not reduced by even a single one. Compared to that, this reduction of distance was overwhelming, and it could be said that their arrival was right before their eyes. Subaru, but anything and everything, comes after escaping away from this nest of the courtesan bears. Completely filling their field of vision, the flower meadow, on top of the sea of sand enshrined majesty, strongly abhorrent. The plants having their roots embedded into the ground, such natural ecology was nowhere here. The slightly floating stems or roots were, not growing from the ground, but from, none other than, the bodies of those repulsive brutes. Around when they would be escaping the territory of the courtesan bears, what Meili had instructed to Subaru and the others was simple: to be as silent as possible. According to her remarks, the courtesan bears were currently lying dormant. They would not thoughtlessly wake them up, but in exchange for that, it seems they would not be able to get an idea of the ferocity of the witch beasts getting up after continuing to lay down. Meili, the bad animal sans being active is the most brutal thing. The exterminated white whale, when appearing immediately after the fog, used to be the most enraged and seemed to be most troublesome too. That was the digression Meili spoke of regarding the white whale. Thinking about it in accordance with that exposition of hers, the exact moment when Subaru and the rest had encountered the white whale at the Lithos highway. In other words, immediately afterwards it had woken up, it had been the worst timing. Memories of suffering resuscitated, he painted his own praise for himself for having that desire of his fulfilled. Regardless of that, Meili, being angry when woken up, goes for everyone, humans, animals, and bad animal sans. That's why, stay completely quiet. If you can do just that, I'll somehow manage from my side. Abiding by the remarks of Meili, who possessed such strong will, thus commenced the march of the row who'd clamped down their breathing. Their battle formation was a substitute for the occasion of capturing the sand dunes, the style of the dragon carriage proceeding further. Sitting as the driver, conveying the intents of the courtesan bears, was Meili, and in accordance with those aims Julius drove the dragon carriage further. Patrash, on which Subaru had a good grip on, attached and detached to the rear of that dragon carriage and raced in a single line. Feeling himself bend, Subaru, holding his breath, clutched onto Beatrice's petite body. Her body temperature could be felt. It seemed that she had stiffened her body and was feeling nervous. On the side of the dragon carriage, upon the roof of the dragon carriage, was present a figure. A figure who need not be suspected, for the familiar silhouette was that of Emilia. Noticing Subaru's gaze, Emilia aimed her amethyst eyes towards him and raised her hand. The reason why Emilia was lying in ambush like that upon the roof was so that she could move instantly in case an issue of some sort rose. Though Subaru would have liked her to quietly stay within the dragon carriage, but with the support of Julius' spirit arts gone, the only ally capable of long-range attacks was Emilia. Though it wasn't as if Beatrice could not do it if she pushed herself, but with a single large blow, Subaru would exhaust his gas. It was a part of Subaru's inferiority complex that, in terms of strength, he had to depend upon others for protecting him as well, if he was present. If that wasn't so, if he did not have to do that, perhaps even REM would. The weakness of thinking in that direction was always present within Subaru. Subaru, hook. With the rise of such uncompromising emotions beyond his control, the back of Beatrice's head pushed up his jaw. At Subaru's surprise, Beatrice snorted her nose. Focus on what is in front of you right now, is what she must have had meant. Looking overhead once again, Emilia too had pointed her finger towards Subaru, and he understood that she was urging for similar caution. Unable to express either compromise or understanding, he exchanged a deep sigh. The truth was that he wanted to slap his cheek and alter his emotions, but that could put his life at risk, an action that could prove to be deadly. And, as Subaru's usual detour of thoughts gave rise to his resolution, the party's forefront arrived at the flower meadow practically at the same time. "Meili, move." At once, Gen halted, pulling the dragon carriage, and Meili's faint voice slipped into the creaking sound of the wheels, and was thrown towards the flower meadow. At first, there being no response to Meili's call, Subaru gritted his molars. "Meili, move." Once again, Meili called out the order. Even still, indeed, no change was born in the flower meadow. In the vexing duration, Subaru's stomach lining started to grumble with something similar to itchiness. And with that distortion, the ground, as if truly being stripped off, the flower meadow arose. Without thinking, looking straight at the form of the witch beast, Subaru's throat seized up. The witch beast, called the courtesan bear, befitting of its name, possessed a figure like that of a bear. The height of the courtesan bear was perhaps around 2 meters to 3 meters. Short legs, in exchange for that, arms long enough to drag on the ground. Its arms visibly concealed under black fur, and claw-like nails growing at the ends, is what he understood. From the rear to the armpits of that body, the vivid flowers swaying was the sort of impression it projected, but, observing that witch beast from close proximity, one's eyes tended to turn towards the front rather than the rear of that body. Though its physique was concealed by black fur, creeping about that body was not body hair. Closely packed, wrapping the body were the finely jumbled together roots of the flowers. They appeared as if blood vessels that were floating on the skin. The minute roots were covering the body of the witch beast. Subaru, hook. On the body covered with closely packed roots, the parts which the roots did not reach were abnormally parched, and both the flesh and skin had withered. Its facial features, its cranium had reached the limit of dehydration to the point where it was visibly obvious, and its circular protuberant eyeballs were bloodshot, wielding hatred for everything in this world. That seemed to be, as if it was slurping the life of the flowers whose roots it had pasted upon its own body. The courtesan bears could not coexist with the flowers. Clearly, they had taken away the lives of the flowers. The witch beast, which gave off an unbearable feeling of revulsion by merely looking at it, followed Meili's words with sluggish movement. Slowly pulling out its body from the ground, as the roots got uprooted from the desert from which nothing could be absorbed, 1,000 sounds of snapping limitlessly chained. For opening up space just so that the dragon carriage could pass, the moving courtesan bears reached 100 in count. And as if knowing no end, their numbers continued to increase. Julius, Hugh. Faintly, Julius' sigh was audible, as the dragon carriage resumed proceeding. Julius, in that state, with his body hair standing up due to the spectacle in front of his sight, must have failed to put up with it. Attached to the rear of the dragon carriage, Subaru and the others as well entered the path bloomed open by the courtesan bears. Subaru, ugh. At exactly that instant, when Subaru's sense of smell crossed the threshold of the courtesan bear's turf, a violent aroma of flowers could be felt. It seemed to be different from the stench of the time of confronting the sand earthworm, with respective difference in quality from that. The sweet scent jumbled together in the situation did not mean that the sense of violence had changed. Their nostrils were invaded, their intracerebral gears simply acquired the hallucination of the sweet scent. Developing serious dizziness, the repulsive stench awakened a headache. Something so exasperating, that he would not mind the sand gusts at all compared to this. This toxic aroma coiling up within his whole body must be driven away, is what he thought with utter seriousness. Such wishes of Subaru were fruitless, and in the absence of any flow of wind, the party proceeded towards the interior of the flower meadow. Subaru, hook. As if having noticed something, Beatrice pulled Subaru's sleeve. Looking at her, wondering what had come up, she was incessantly concerned regarding something behind them. Turning around at that gesture whilst keeping that repulsive premonition in mind, the meaning of Beatrice's reaction could be understood. The space in the flowers that opened up in accordance with Meili's instructions, looking at the passage of the dragon carriage and Patrash, from the close proximity to that till the very end, the scenery was steadily returning to how it originally was. Meili's orders came true, and the dragon carriage being able to pass at this particular point in time according to the instructions had been achieved. Returning to their original positions and entering into the state of lying dormant, could that be their plans? Even if they did not intend to return, they were still unable to stop midway. Of course, taking a break in the midst of this nest of these witch beasts, such jokes needed to be refrained from as well. Subaru, The moment immediately after he'd thought that, the dragon carriage's advance came to a pause. Looking at the front, wondering what had happened, the reason behind the dragon carriage's halt was explicit. A lone courtesan bear, in front of the dragon carriage, got up and stood still, and turned those hollow eyes towards the two drivers. With that one alone making suspicious movements, the movements of the courtesan bears in the vicinity too, started to change. The feet of the courtesan bears, who had, till now, stolidly and obediently made way, stopped, and as if tracing the actions of the one staring at the dragon carriage, their gazes accumulated on the dragon carriage. This is bad, was the intuitive realization Subaru had. Looking back, they had already covered several hundreds of meters since entering the flower meadow. With the pathway behind plugged up, it was clear that they had been surrounded by the courtesan bears from all directions. Their numbers were in the hundreds, or possibly even in the thousands. A violent difference in numbers. Thinking that far, his gaze entwined with that of Amelia's, who was on top of the roof. Amelia was looking down onto the courtesan bear in front, and was puzzled over what kind of judgment she should deal it. If the outbreak of a fight, just as till now, could be avoided, then clearing the front ward of the dragon carriage with Amelia's magic and running through was the optimal way. However, she did not want to mistake the timing and rush things too fast. Melee, SHH. And in front of Subaru and the rest who were puzzled regarding their judgment, the one with utmost composure was Melee. Putting a finger on her lips, she calmed the indecisive Subaru and the others beforehand. Following afterwards, she pointed the finger she had on her lips towards the front, and scowled at the courtesan bear looking at her. Melee, TCH TCH TCH. A finger pointing outwards, and a sound, as if flicking her tongue, leaked out of Melee's lips. That was a sigh, like what humans made to soothe kittens. If the subject truly was a kitten, then it would give a pleasant impression as well, but with the fiendish witch beast as the subject, there was no mitigation whatsoever. However, all of Melee's fingers jolted at her tongue sound, and gradually, the courtesan bear's line of sight shifted, from the two drivers, to Melee alone, and then moved to Melee's fingers. Melee, TCH TCH TCH. TCH. At the same pace, obtaining certainty that the courtesan bear's focus was on the finger, Melee slowly swung her hand, which had her fingers pointed towards the right of the dragon carriage. Lured to the movement of that arm, the courtesan bear, which had brought the dragon carriage to a standstill, turned its face towards that and moved, taking a single step in that direction. Subaru, At the courtesan bear's conduct, of distancing itself away from the dragon carriage, a reflexive sigh of relief leaked out of Subaru's throat. Amelia or Beatrice too, who had stiffened their bodies up too, loosened their shoulders in relief. When the one who had caused a standstill moved, the other courtesan bears too, tried to return to their own movements of distancing themselves. At the same pace, the march through the flower meadow resumed was how it was supposed to be. Hook. At that moment, the thread of tension snapped, and nobody could be condemned for raising their voice. Suddenly, in the situation of enduring under compulsion of utmost limits of the stalemate, the thing known as the heart could not stand strong. That goes for humans and for ground dragons as well. Showered upon with the pressure of losing to the courtesan bear, Gan gave out a short growl and stamped its feet on the ground, as if enraged. Subaru, oh sure Hook. At Gan's roar, which abruptly cut off the silence, the courtesan bears, which were in a state of lying dormant, reacted altogether at once. The one attempting to distance itself away from the dragon carriage turned back, and that reaction infected the environs as well. The witch beasts rose, and leapt upon the dragon carriage with their bare fangs. Immediately before Amelia, El Huma. The mana materialized rapidly, and the spearhead of the formed ice lance penetrated through the witch beast's cranium. The sharp vanguard of ice pierced through its large mouth, infringing upon its oral cavity, and broke through its nape. Its brain churned, the courtesan bear, without raising its voice, collapsed backwards as it faced annihilation. Caught up in that vigor, several courtesan bears, without pause, toppled sideways. Subaru, run! Shouted Subaru, instantaneously after witnessing the attack by Amelia, who was on top of the dragon carriage. Concording to that call, Julius operated the reins and the dragon carriage started running fiercely at once. Of course, Patrash too followed that, jumping away from the side of the witch beast standing stock still, and broke off in a savage sprint. Hook. Subaru, they recoming ing. Delayed by a single beat, the cutthroat, fierce voice tore apart the night of the Augria sand dunes. The vast flower meadow was shredded apart at once, with fangs and unsightly appearances naked. The flock sloth of courtesan bears advanced on, aiming for the dragon carriage, fiercely plunging its way through. Beatrice, Subaru. Firmly grip on, or you will get thrown off. In fact, the hallucination bathing in strength was the pressure of the thirst for blood and appetite of the innumerable courtesan bears. With thick arms endowed with claws turned overhead, their merciless attack struck Subaru as well, who was riding the dragon. A direct hit in his body would get torn off easily, with strength that could assuredly force his internal organs to protrude outwards. However, just when it was on the brink of striking, a bluish-white glimmer cut in between and pierced through the witch beasts. Amelia, hi. Yeah. All right, Hook. You. These, Huma. As always, with the mana forming a whirlpool and her voice coming from her heart, giving the impression that the bluish-white light was performing a boisterous dance in the dark sky, that was the transformation of countless sharp spearheads pointing above the ground into blades of ice. That was, immediately after the stagnation of a single moment, firing as if having acquired the propulsive force, tearing the craniums, the arms, the torsos, the legs of the courtesan bears swarming upon the dragon carriage into shreds, giving rise to spouts of blood. Subaru. As expected of Emilia Tan. I've fallen for you again. Emilia, this is not the time for saying such things, is it? Run. Subaru, yes. Having his life saved by Emilia's follow-up, Subaru further accelerated Patrash. And with the sudden exchange, Emilia was coping with the fight with such composure that it was surprising. In retrospect, even if Emilia had shirked from fighting, it was not as if fighting intimidated her. The tendency to avoid fighting within her was the indecision that had been erased once that battle had broken out. Ram, Barusu, run till you die. If you do not wish to die. Subaru, yeah, of course, Ram. The tough fight being put up by Emilia, the bluish-white light mowed down the front ward of the dragon carriage altogether, and the group of courtesan bears, who had taken a roundabout path, were frozen all at once. Within Gan's rush and breaking through the ice sculpture, sitting on the driver's seat gripping to the reins, was suddenly now Ram, having moved from the passenger compartment. At Ram, who was skillfully handling the reins, driving the earth dragon which was in an agitated state, Subaru peeled open his eyes, and let his gaze wander around. Subaru, what about Julius? Ram, even if there are no means for a long-range attack, it seemed it would be unhelpful if he were to be the driver. That's why. At a glance, Ram looked towards the rear at Subaru's call. Lured to that line of sight and looking backwards, Subaru thoughtlessly felt dumbfounded. Biting the sand, beside the dragon carriage with its wheels roaring, clinging onto one of those ornaments, waving about the grasped knight sword, was the form of Julius, clearing away the approaching witch beasts. Julius, burdening Emilia-sama with responsibilities and such, cannot be done either, you see. Subaru, was that directed at me? Julius, that would be. Putting a halt to his words there, Julius had his knight sword meet with the claws of the approaching witch beasts. The decapitating slash weaved through the gap of those claws, and deeply gorged into the arms of the courtesan bears. At the same pace, the dancing tip of the sword pierced through the throats of the witch beasts, who let out screams, and as if a flash, it granted death by destroying their brainstem. That dance, with minimal destruction, was truly debonair. Julius, wrong. Successively crushing the witch beasts, Julius voiced what remained of his reply to Subaru while dusting away his sword. Subaru made a bitter face at that gesture, tasting reassurance and a sense of defeat. Simply, having put Emilia in charge of the long range, clearing away the close range was down to Julius. If that structure were to continue, the concern regarding the dragon carriage could be saved for later. Rather, the problem was, instead of other affairs, but in this course. Subaru, Biko, can you go for it? Beatrice, Subaru too, be careful that you don't run out of gas, I suppose. Above Patrash, raising his body, Subaru held the reins with one hand, and the armed Beatrice with the other, and made her small body stand on top of the dragon. And steadily clasping each other's hands, something throbbed in the interior of Subaru's guts. That something, as if seeming sediment, wielded heat, and slowly streamed from Subaru's body into Beatrice's. Beatrice, Minya. The crystals of violet materialized with the chant, and aimed for the witch beasts blocking the path ahead of the ground dragon's nose. Accurate aiming, momentary advancement, the outcome visible immediately afterwards. Raising a sound as that of shattering glass, the magical attack directly struck the witch beasts, and the crystals fragmented. However, the following moment, the bodies of the witch beasts fragmented similarly as well. Subaru, alright, good going, Biko. Beatrice, but reckless firing cannot be done, in fact. Cautiously saving. Minya. Subaru, what about the cautiously saving? Beatrice's battle strength depended upon the mana left within Subaru. In order to oppose the overwhelmingly advancing threat, even Beatrice was unable to compromise much. Tasting the seeming sense of loss, as if his soul was being curtailed with every single attack of magic, Subaru, talkative and composed, abetted Beatrice's nervousness. Of course, such consideration was clearly visible to Beatrice. Melee, enough. Why did it turn out like this? This could have been taken away. And, the one who had been keeping their silence till now, the final ordnance stood up and trod. A driver, having been sat beside Ram, Melee, with her eyes tearing up, surveyed the swarm of courtesan bears crowding around their surroundings while making a red face. And, she pointed a finger towards the witch beasts who would not obey her. Melee, I'll give a scolding to the bad animal sands. Come, sand earthworm. Subaru, no way. Immediately after Melee pouted and declared like a child, the desert that had been turned up thanks to the rise of courtesan bears, and with the underneath of that sand being stirred up subsequently, a big frame rushed out. Swallowed within the vigor of the gigantic beast pushing its whole body out from the underground, the countless courtesan bears dragged within were launched up into the sky. Falling on the sand from a high altitude, the witch beasts had their bones broken, and the unfortunate courtesan bears directly above that humongous mouth got chewed up. Thrusting out while tearing apart the desert, the one laying devastation upon the repulsive flower meadow was that sand earthworm. Wafting the stench, raising a strange voice slashing through twilight, the sand earthworm determined the courtesan bears clinging onto the dragon carriage as its prey, and leaping with that big frame, minced and destroyed them at once. Melee, go, sand earthworm. Crush everyone, everyone. Subaru, are you serious, hey? Arius Rius Arius Rius Arius Rius, hey hi he. The weight, capable of creating rumbles in the ground, writhed through the sand sea, and the wails of the courtesan bears being crushed by the pressure of the humongous frame echoed. Courtesan bears too, did not possess a petite build whatsoever, but they could not possibly compete with the figures of sand earthworms, whose overall length could be even above 10 meters. The overwhelming masses turned into the outcome of collisions, and the courtesan bears got successively turned into corpses. At the circumstance which was a decisive battle between monsters at this point, Subaru had no words appropriate for it. Emilia and Beatrice's magic, Julia's swordsmanship, Melee's unusual talent narrowly cleared the way, and the dragon carriage and Patrash rapidly proceeded through the flower meadow. Melee, ah! The sand earthworm is. Melee's shriek was heard. Observing it, the sand earthworm, possessed by a great number of courtesan bears, who had their claws gouged into that humongous frame, was shedding large quantities of bodily fluids from its entire body, and collapsed on the ground. The outer skin of the slimy and soaking wet sand earthworm was not something as sturdy as that of snakes or insects. The skin sustaining the soft body easily fell prey to the claws, and a wail of agonizing death reverberated through the sand sea. Melee, next. Next. Keep coming fast. Once a single giant collapsed, Melee clasped her hands with a pallid face. And, lured to that, once again the sand was uplifted, and a different sand earthworm made its appearance. This time there were 6 at the same time, however, compared to the first one, they were twice as small, and if they were to get enclosed by the swarm of courtesan bears, they would get hunted down in the blink of an eye. Subaru, at this pace. Hook. They would get outpushed in the amount of violence. With a sense of terrible hopelessness, Subaru desperately looked at his environs in search of something that could help them break out of this deadlock. And he noticed. The watchtower that had been so distant was close enough to be said that it was right before their eyes. Subaru, just a little bit left. If we can follow up to the watchtower at this pace. It was not as if the witch beasts would withdraw with this, but it appeared likely that there may lie some fearful power there. At that moment, it was not as if he had thought something special. However, if they were to follow up to the watchtower, he felt there may be the strength to break free of the deadlock of this situation. The spirit of hope was like clinging onto straws. And in reality, that was no mistake. Subaru, at this rate. However, that strength was not something so convenient. It was the iron hammer which rained incessantly without bias upon all insolent comrades approaching the Pleiades watchtower. Pushing open his eyes desperately, supporting Beatrice while clinging to Patrash, Subaru scowled at the watchtower visible in front of him. Sweat dripping along, the moment he dimly narrowed his eyes, Subaru felt a faint sense of discomfort. The core of the tower, something was visible there, as if shining. Subaru, what's that? He was unable to resume onto the final word. The luster bolted through the sky, and its aim unchangingly landed a direct hit on Subaru's cranium. At that moment, everything above the neck of Natsuki Subaru was blown off by the attack, and evaporated with the same unconsciousness. There present was nobody who could observe and raise their voice, at the tragic scene of a single moment. For some reason, those who would have had observed it, and those who would have had screamed at it, had been thoroughly pulled up by the root and branch. The earth-ground dragon which had lost its head, giving rise to a report, collapsed. Caught up within the vigor of the dragon carriage toppling sideways, the human bodies who had indeed lost their craniums were pulverized, shattered under the pressure, turned into chunks of meat. Only the pond of blood lay upon the sand, and the parched sand gulped down the blood spilt from the bodies. Before long, gradually, slowly, the fine particles of sand dragged anything and everything rotting on the sand sea down to their belly, and concealed them. The flowers of blood, as if the only visage of their journey, bequeathed the vivid colors. However, even those flowers of deep red disappeared within the evermore swallowing sand. Here, the party greeted annihilation. Chapter 11, The Audible Tearful Voice. What had been visible was the luster, nothing but that. He remembered he had tilted his neck upwards. Also the moment initially afterwards, one section of the tower in front, white luster, and him narrowing his eyes at that dazzle. However, what lay in his memories was only till that point. He did not remember anything thereafter. Neither ache, nor impact, nor terror, he did not feel a single thing. For Natsuki Subaru, these were all indispensable retinues in the advent of death. Neither did he have the ache to make him wail in tears, nor the impact that would scatter his body into 1,000 fragments, nor the terror of losing everything. Otherwise that death may have had been a much more kind-hearted death than what Subaru was normally acquainted with. Above all, Subaru, who had died and gotten his brain evaporated, did not have any free time whatsoever to think about it, nor could he merely think back to it and absorb himself into it. As if in the blink of an eye, the moment immediately after he thought his field of vision had been caged within darkness, the lost life of Natsuki Subaru was resuscitated, regurgitated, and once again, into reality, was abandoned. TCH. Subaru, hook. For a single moment, feeling the weight of gloom upon his 5 senses, as if clogging up his breath, Subaru opened his eyes. Discerning the clamorous sound of the whole body of the dragon carriage, his contracting muscles screamed out in pain. The reins he had clenched so tightly that his nails could eat away into his palm, and the warm temperature insisting their existence. Beatrice. Subaru, what? Within his faint field of vision, he looked down at the back of Beatrice's head from close proximity. The violent sweet aroma sliding into his nostrils was again different from the one when he had hugged the young girl. Beatrice's scent was like that of freshly prepared sweet confectionaries, but what wafted in the air now was, as if adhesive toxicity, self-assertive sweetness. He had memories of this sweetness. It was natural. It was what, just recently, he had continued to smell ad nauseum. Rather, even if it was only for a limited number of minutes, what was special was that it had been interrupted. TCH. Upon Subaru's dusky consciousness, reached a rhythmic sound, as if the clicking of a tongue. In front of his eyes, was Beatrice with her body stiffened up, and Patrash who was holding her breath in, watching over what lay ahead of its nose, the dragon carriage carrying Amelia and Rem, and standing ahead of that dragon carriage was a repulsive witch beast. With fine roots stretching across its entire body, the truculent witch beast starved of blood, it was a courtesan bear. For a single moment, unable to express it as a déjà vu, the fresh sense of reality returned to Subaru. That feeling was not to be doubted. It was returned by death. Natsuki Subaru had just now, experiencing death, returned to this moment in time. Subaru, hook. But of all things, returning to this moment. Rather than the moment of transpiration of death, he cursed at how unfavorable the timing he had returned by death to was. Inviting the interest of the witch beast by the sound of clicking her tongue, the one trying to remove it from the front of the dragon carriage silently, was Meili. That scheme was only barely successful, however, and it fell through in the end. The ground dragon pulling the dragon carriage Gan was unable to bear the pressure of the witch beast, was the reason for it. While being aware of that, Subaru instantaneously hesitated in making a judgment. The state of the vital Gan was invisible from the rear. But Julius, who had clenched the reins, would not encourage the unusualness of the ground dragon. There simply lay nothing special there for him to turn his eyes towards. Each one in the dragon carriage was praying for the success of Meili's contact with the courtesan bears. However, unfortunately, that was Meili. TCH. Meili's voice wielded a faint sense of stress, and her finger pointed towards the right of the dragon carriage. Lured to that movement, the courtesan bear slowly stepped its feet ahead in that direction. An ambience of solace originated within the dragon carriage, and for Beatrice as well. However, Gan was unable to stand up to the slicing of the thread of tension. Subaru, Julie. Hook. Without being able to make the correct judgment, his call was obstructed by Gan's roar. As if going through the recent progression once again, Gan stomped the ground while letting out a roar, and at that wail and rumbling, the courtesan bear's consciousness was awoken at once. Further exposing their bloodshot eyes, the courtesan bears leapt with their drool dripping down. Bluish-white radiance perforated through those craniums, the flow had been completely the same until the blast. Amelia, El Huma. Amelia, standing on top of the dragon carriage, turned over both her hands, as if fluttering in the wind, and created a maelstrom of ice blades in the sky, with movement like that of an elegant dance. The revolving blades of ice successively were fired, with their aim set above ground, as if the encircling notes of a musical saw. The sloth of courtesan bears was swallowed within the lethal weapons of ice, as they raised their death wails with their limbs being slashed away. Subaru, run hook. Pulling the reins and speeding up Patrash, the dragon carriage too moved when Subaru raised his voice. He glanced sideways at the driver, Ram, who had suddenly appeared, having exchanged the position of driver with Julius, and at Julius, wielding his knight sword, who launched sword slashes upon the approaching courtesan bears, along with a barrage of kicks. That was what he was able to understand. Completely the same. Having gone with the flow, Subaru strongly gritted his molars. His consciousness being unable to catch up, due to the sudden return by death, would not make for an excuse. Putting off the impact of having passed away, Subaru's heart covered his remorse. It could be said that ever since he became aware of return by death, up until now, this had been the first time for Subaru that he had wasted return by death. Missing out on the information received through return by death, the result was that he was simply heading for another death. However, this was the first time he was tracing the very same situation, despite return by death, without even any establishment of a trick of some sort. Subaru's own puzzlement, unrelated to his intentions while thinking that, the rail of destiny was yet the same. Beatrice, Subaru. There is no free time for you to be spacing out, in fact. Subaru, hook. Lying face down in regret, tightly gripping to the reins was Subaru, and Beatrice struck her back on his chest. Looking ahead at the light impact and voice, he was able to see the truculent witch beasts advancing speedily. At the same time, grasping the small palm reaching out, making Beatrice stand on top of the dragon, thus commenced the counter-attack. Beatrice, Minya. Minya. One more time, Minya, I suppose. Through the palm, the aimless mana within Subaru's body was absorbed and resolved into power for Beatrice. The materialized crystals of violet pierced into the bodies of the witch beasts, obstructing their path, and as the crystals shattered those bodies, Patrash proceeded while stepping firmly onto the scattered fragments. Melee, held in reserve, sand earthworm. Hearing Melee shout, who had grown desperate, the sand at the corner of his vision spouted up. The desert covered by courtesan bears, making its appearance from further below that, the sand earthworm tossed several numbers of the witch beasts within its huge jaws, and putting together its humongous frame enough to make one look upwards, proceeded to crush its enemies. The second great decisive battle of monsters, but Subaru was aware of how unfavorable this was. Ram, Barusu. Run till you die. If you do not want to die. At Subaru, who was grilling in formless restlessness, a seemingly reprimanding voice was launched. Controlling the reins at the driver's position, driving the agitated Gan, was Ram. She was driving the dragon carriage fully in control, with her handling of the reins no inferior than that of REM, but, at this pace, this was no good. Subaru, it will be no good if you keep going straight ahead at this rate. Ram, change direction. Ram, hook. What are you trying to say? The watchtower is right in front, the surroundings are all territories of the witch beasts. Subaru, that is plausible, but still, that won't be any good. Patrash lowered her head, and pierced right through the torso of the courtesan bear in front. While having the writhing witch beast right in front of her nose, the jet-black ground dragon rushed ahead madly while using the body of the witch beast as a shield. The continuous slashes being hammered in tore apart the body of the witch beast, and its dancing fallen petals and fresh blood soaked the sand sea. Ram, Barusu, what did you notice? Say it clearly. Subaru, there wouldn't be any problems if I could explain clearly. At any rate, it's a change of course. At Ram's words, which had a tone of irritation, all Subaru could do as well was to yell violently back. He himself realized it was a terribly absurd response, but he had no measures other than that. After all, the current Subaru was unaware of the cause of his death. His return by death was unquestionable, and yet, he could not remember the reason for his death. Noticing it, regarding the point of return by death, this time it was close to how it felt when he had met death for the first time in the Roswell mansion. From the point of confirming the cause of death, and eliminating that problem. Subaru, the time for that, is nowhere here. Having been caught up by the witch beasts, he had fallen prey to those slashes. Just as how the bar's bartender had warned, had he become the cruel bait of having his intestines slurped on. Otherwise, inadvertently falling from Patrash, he may have unfortunately fractured his neck. It was a thought really, truly difficult, but he may have broken down due to Beatrice utilizing his mana excessively. That was not impossible either. Subaru, whichever it may be, the memories haven't suddenly stopped till now. Even if his guts were cleaved open, even if he was put down in ice, even if his head was crushed by a morning star, even if his whole body was devoured greedily by rabbits, even if he was eaten away by entangling with an absurd authority, Subaru did return by death. And regardless of what the cause of death may be, eliminating and defeating what had occurred right before his own death, which was stalemating him, it had been used as a method for that. That fragile string of fate was nowhere visible this time. And the time to search for that fine string was not bestowed upon Subaru and the others. This was simply the worst entrapment of return by death. In the scenario where he possibly passed away by the same method, it would be a completely fumbling restart. Before that happened. Subaru, move from here. Whatever you do, don't get close to the tower. Ram, again, why so? Subaru, the tower will shine. Probably, that light is dangerous. Ram, ha. In the situation where they had been nothing but cornered, even Ram did not have the time to varnish the blades of her words with poison. While clashing with the voice possessing a frank tone of repudiation, Subaru pulled the reins and conveyed that to Patrash. To not go straight ahead, but divert their purpose at any rate. Subaru, the tower may be visible, right in front but right in the middle of the advancement of the courtesan bears in great numbers in the Sand Sea, the watchtower right in front of their eyes was clearly getting closer. However, what awaited them if they truly got close to it was only the scorch of before. For that to not happen, what Subaru had to choose was Subaru, run backwards. It would be better to pass through sand time one more time. Let's go back to that earlier sand dune. Ram, what nonsense have you been? Amelia, Ram. Do as Subaru says. At the determination where it could not be helped but think he had lost his mind, Ram raised a voice of repudiation, which Amelia detained. While she purged the witch beasts with countless ice shards, she nodded at Subaru. Amelia, because there's no way Subaru would say something weird without giving thought to it. Ram, Barusu ordinarily lives by wetting his pants with thoughtless words and nonsense. Amelia, because there's no way Subaru would say something weird without giving thought to it in a dangerous situation. Subaru, thank you for going out of your way and correcting it. Whether he should lament being treated as a young wolf in sheep's clothing, or be delighted that he was a man who could be relied upon in times of a pinch. Keeping both introspection and conceit for later, Patrash, moving according to Subaru's intentions, thrust her feet on the sandy soil and suddenly turned round. Her tail cutting through the air mowed down the abdomen of the witch beast, and kicking down one of the courtesan bears with her leg, she ran backwards. Ram, hook. The two of you on the top and side. Make sure you don't fall off. Seeing their sudden turning around, Ram, too, had again turned around by skillfully handling the reins. Naturally, the dragon carriage, having to eat the centrifugal force at that moment, inclined greatly and turned sideways but Julius, Amelia-sama. The foothold. Amelia? Ah, is that so? Yes. Thrusting his sword fiercely into the body of the vehicle and supporting his body, Julius brought aid to Amelia's attention to the inclining dragon carriage. Amelia rounded her eyes at those words, and magical power headed instantaneously towards directly underneath of the dragon carriage. As if assisting the wheel that had tilted due to the inclination, a slope of ice was born, and the dragon carriage, as if painting a semicircle, rushed and evaded toppling sideways. Furthermore, at the same pace, without killing off the vigor, commenced the backward dash which followed Patrash. Immediately afterward, Subaru, wah. Hook. The moment following the commencement of the backward dash, echoed a metallic shrill, as if slashing one's eardrums. Thoughtlessly shrugging his shoulders was Subaru. From the rear, a sudden gale was born. Subaru, the one right now was. Hey hi he. Beatrice, what, I suppose. Ha. Sensing the enigma arise behind, Subaru and Beatrice, turning back at the same time, expressed astonishment. On top of the dragon carriage racing immediately behind them, Amelia and Julius too widened their eyes. Melee, sand earthworm, Chan is. Hook. Leaning forward her body on the driver's seat, with her throat trembling in astonishment, was Melee. In front of her eyes, in that shape, a visage behind the dragon carriage, as if concealing it, with the large build of the sand earthworm being thrown up. With the frame of a span over 10 meters, with thickness of body such that two men may not be able to rotate it with their arms. Protruding its head above the ground, the form lording over its prey seemed as if it was the ruler of the sand sea. The body of that sand earthworm, receiving the direct hit of that something, was blown off into fragments. That slimy body skin suffered 1,000 pierces, and the thick body of great length was splendidly divided into two. The body that had lost its head toppled sideways, and the head, having lost its support, slowly, headed towards them, trickling. Subaru, get aside, dodge it. The fallen head of the sand earthworm had excess mass which could crush the dragon carriage under its pressure. With the death agony of the witch beasts crushed under the pressure of the body that had, just now, fallen behind, Subaru and Ram subsequently transmitted instructions to the ground dragons, overbearingly averted their routes and escaped the course of the sand earthworm's direct hit. Hook. Raising a shrill tearful voice, the sand earthworm's head fell onto the sand sea with great vigor. The sand whirled up, the bones of the courtesan bears, injured while escaping, crumbled into fragments and fell, and their limbs, having been caught up in the impact, were blown off. At the same pace, the head of the sand earthworm bounced, while entangling with the inevitable future of the witch beasts, tumbled, and finally suffered countless slashes, quickly turning into fragments of flesh. Subaru, danger, us. Beatrice, Subaru, this was a mistake, in fact. He'd felt relieved for evading the crisis of the moment, but, instantaneously, Beatrice rejected that relief. Looking at the young girl at his chest wondering what had happened, she cleared away the fallen, fluttering petals with a troubled expression, and surveyed the rear. Beatrice, from the one just now, the dragon carriage on the other side has gone astray, I suppose. There is only Betty and you. Subaru, what did you say? Pursuing her gaze in panic, Subaru confirmed the absence of the figure of the dragon carriage in the surroundings. Only the distant radiance of bluish-white mana and roars of witch beasts. Furthermore, discovering a place slightly exposed to the sandy gale, he was able to understand from his view through the immense distance, the hard fight being put up by Amelia and their new servant, Melee. However, even if they tried to meet up with the other side, the space between them was overflowing with a countless number of courtesan bears. And for Subaru and the rest, with diminished number of moves, there were no indications that the fierce attack of the witch beasts had been weakened. Subaru, simply, half the war potential. The number of enemies are double. Beatrice, compared to earlier, it has increased to 4 times, I suppose. Brandishing the claws at the face of the courtesan bears attacking, the cusp of the whip let out a roar. The striking impact, fortunately, crushed the eyes of the witch beast and breaking through the one trembling in violent pain, Patrash dashed once again. However, that course of direction had a different direction than that of the dragon carriage of Amelia and the others. Subaru, Patrash. Not this way. Beatrice, it is this ground dragon's own judgment to be left alive, in fact. Rather than Subaru or Betty, leaving it to its instincts would be better, I suppose. Interrupting Subaru's outcry, Beatrice kicked and dispersed away the witch beasts standing in their way with magic. Patrash marked the points where the tight besiegement and broke through them, risking her own life for protecting the two on its back. Subaru, shit. This again. This shape again. What am I doing? Swinging the whip, he struck the faces of the witch beasts trying to get closer. However, with this, he would not be able to stop the power of the witch beasts, having an expression of having lost reason. Inflicting fatal wounds with the saber, he sharpened their dynamism with magic. The power Subaru chose, even with any of those, it would not be even remotely attainable. All craftiness would get crushed under the pressure of overwhelming power. Doing what he could do, augmenting whatever he had the ability to do, it had become slightly easier, is what he had thought, and yet. The mere superficial cleverness of Natsuki Subaru, was fate only going to exhale a laughing sigh at it and trample upon and crush it? Subaru, I had somehow managed better at the time of that shitty bastard Regulus. Beatrice, there is no time for such deep thinking, in fact. Are there any ways to? Subaru, Biko, Murak on Patrash. Lighten her weight, then we can cross over the swarm. Beatrice, Murak. Accepting Subaru's directions, Beatrice used Murak on Patrash, a magic that abets the effect of gravity, and the speed at which they ran further accelerated. Stepping and racing ahead, the distance doubled, and the leaping Patrash used the witch beasts as a place to stand on, and tried to withdraw from the writhing flower meadow. But Subaru, the Lee. In close proximity to his eyes appeared a white purge, and the moment he turned his voice inside out, that dashed through the sky. The white purge above ground ran through, and the sand sea was blown off by the terrific force. Facing the swift bolt of the purge, the bodies of the witch beasts were torn apart, spouting out blood, as they leapt. And that aftermath swooped down upon Patrash as well, agitated by the wind pressure of that which was closing on the large build of the ground dragon, and got easily flipped. Subaru, Beatrice. Hold tight. Beatrice, Subaru too, make sure you're hugging firmly, I suppose. Patrash, hook. Patrash neighed, and Subaru hugged and clung to Beatrice's body. Spinning and revolving in the air, the large build of Patrash pranced overhead of the courtesan bears. As if pursuing that Patrash, the corona continuously downpoured incessantly. The sand was burst open, the witch beasts who got dragged into it, and had to receive it were burst open, and the appearing and quickly disappearing Patrash raised an echo of distress. Subaru Oeya. In the midst of the attack, the divine protection of wind evasion failed, and Subaru tasted that impact altogether. Grasping the reins in Beatrice, he had firmly interposed both his feet in Patrash's saddle, but, rubbed by the force, with his body being struck hard in parts here and there, he barely managed to grasp to his consciousness. However, regardless of even that state, the pursuit of the claws of the courtesan bears under his eyes continued to shoot. Swallowed in the terrific attack, he floundered without being thrown off. Now, if he were to fall, no way would he be saved. What barely connected his life was precisely because he had not given up. Subaru, but, at this rate. Beatrice, not good in fact. Hook. Subaru, Patrash. With the remarkably strong impact, Patrash's roar of anguish pulled back her tall tail. Looking at it, at the sight of Patrash, who was flipping around lightly through the effect of Murak, had been exposed to the claws of the courtesan bears and had been slashed. With the scars of the claws etched into the jet-black scales, painful to even look at, from the mouth of the deep gash flowing and spilling was fresh blood. Subaru, hook, Tumbling down with the same pace due to that force, Patrash suddenly fell on top of the desert. At the same time, Subaru and the others were thrown onto the sandy soil as well, and were left behind on the feeding ground of the courtesan bears crowding their surroundings. Shaking his head, his body rose, while continuing to hold Beatrice's hand. She too dusted off the hem of her dress and stood up, and quickly observed the surroundings with no negligence in her eyes. However, their advantage was undeniable. Subaru, you bastards! Don't you dare lay a single finger on Patrash. Beatrice, Minya. Wounded, Patrash groaned in agony, as magic pierced through the witch beasts flooding towards it. Subaru pulled Beatrice's hand and rushed over to Patrash, and kneeling down, touched the wound. The claws had not reached her intestines, but if she pushed herself, her guts might brim out. She could not be allowed to push herself. He also needed time to heal it. Subaru, Beatrice. Shamak. Deceive the perceptibility of the witch beasts around. Beatrice, now. Even if that's done, it'll do nothing but buy time, in fact. On top of that. Subaru, that time is needed for now. Hurry. Bending their stance with bloodshot eyes, the witch beasts awaited for a gap to swoop in. Coping with them would be impossible if they assailed from all directions. The witch beasts eventually became impertinent, and what would be their cue depended on their patience. That could perhaps not be expected. Beatrice, hook. El Shamak. Beatrice joined both of her hands together, and something entirely fell out of Subaru's interior. It rolled towards the whirlpool within the hand of the girl beside, becoming quiet power. It swept through the sand sea, and with Subaru and the rest as the center, tens of meters in its radius, were wrapped up in black mist. With the foundation of shadow magic, this was the invocation of Shamak. Producing discord in perception, the expanse of Shamak brought the courtesan bear's conduct to a standstill. Conception vanished beyond understanding, and even the instinct to chase after prey gets forgotten. Of course, it did not show effect on Subaru and the others, who had executed it. However, it did not last long. Beatrice, if the ones beyond the scope of efficacy get in, it would eventually be laid to waste, I suppose. Before that, escape along with that ground dragon. Subaru, I know. The effect of Murak is still left, right? If that's so, then I'll carry Patrash on my shoulders. At any rate, continuously fire Shamak and joining up with the dragon carriage on the other side is what we should. Withdrawing from the gambling room, judging to prioritize that, he extended his hands to Patrash. Normally its large frame would weigh several hundred kilos, but in the interval it was adhering to Beatrice's Murak. That body, like a feather, would be an exaggeration. It had become light. Not enough to be able to shoulder it and run. Her yellow eyes were intently looking at Subaru. The emotions passing by in those eyes were complex, eloquence such that nobody could ever imagine being a ground dragon's expression. Those eyes were telling them, please leave. Beatrice, Subaru. Immediately after his eyes were robbed by the glint in Patrash's eyes, Beatrice raised a sharp voice. She, rushing over, aimed for Subaru's palm. The surging magical power took form of a shield, and right next to Subaru arrived a magical wall of violet, and it averted the fired white luster. Subaru, Goa. Reverberated the sharp sound as if an exchange of blows of steel, and Subaru's body, receiving the impact, flew backwards. Tumbling over and falling with limbs stretched out on top of the sand, the violently coughing Subaru noticed after trying to lift his body up. Blood was dripping out of his right side, which had suffered the impact, and that it had his right leg thickly soaking. Subaru, what did I receive? Grasping the side overflowing with blood, exhaled Subaru reflexively with one of knees knelt down. At that moment, the impact which had ransacked his internal organs gives rise to vomiting, and gastric juices, and blood ceaselessly gushed forth out of the edge of his mouth. Air exited out of his fissured abdomen, and a goofy sound like that of fart leaked out along with the foaming blood. Subaru, HF. Beatrice, Baru. Subaru. As he exhaled hoarsely, his field of vision simultaneously inclined right beside him. Toppling sideways, he understood he had lost the ability to move his body. He had understood, but nothing more than that could he continue. The wound on his side heated up, and there lay the pain as if his body was melting away. Desperately, he heard the voice calling for his self. Beatrice, Subaru. Subaru, don't I suppose. Dying is. Don't die. Don't leave Betty alone. Hook. Stop. Hook. His shoulder was being shook. At the audible tearful voice, he wanted to stretch his hand out, but he could not move. His brain tissues were burning, he became unable to remember the young girl in front of his eyes. An adorable face, but it was crying. She shouldn't make a crying face, is what he thought. On the other side of that, a large lizard lay collapsed. Black, it was a lizard with a beautiful appearance. In that body, a white long and narrow something of an unknown source, unknown origin was lunging through, with no movement whatsoever. It was clearly dead. Perhaps his own self had received the same thing, is what he thought. Don't leave Betty behind, plea. Hook. Sobbing, the young girl desperately hugged Subaru's body. With that petite frame, Subaru's body, who had lost his strength, would be too heavy. Tears streamed down her cheeks. He wanted to at least wipe away those tears. He searched for a part that was still mobile in his body, but he was unable to find anything. That is why he hauled something mobile from someplace else, not in his body. Subaru, Hook. Subaru? Invisible to the eyes, the hand only himself could see, wiped the tears on her cheeks. Black fingers caressed her teardrops, and the girl looked at him, making an expression as if she had noticed something. The strength to smile and reassure her, even that, he did not possess. Suba. For a single moment, the young girl tried to say something. However, that was interrupted by the white purge that came flying behind her from a distance. The second attack lunged through Subaru's chest. Slowly turning his gaze towards that, it had perforated through the back of the young girl. Furthermore, piercing through Subaru's chest, it came out from behind. Leaving behind a dusky sigh, the form of the young girl, hugging Subaru, disappeared. As if she did not belong to this realm, the form of the young girl was rendered invisible. Losing support, Subaru collapsed on the spot. He could not move. He did not have the reason to move. Subaru, KHO? His weakly moving fingers scratched the sand, that was all. Losing its caster, the black fog which was interposing the environs in space, was dispersed by the breeze. Divulging from the magic that deceived perception, all what remained was only the corpse of a ground dragon, and a young boy on the verge of death. The flock sloth of which beasts slurped on their tongues, and advanced closer to that prey. His breath stopped, the focus of his eyes blurred. Excessive blood loss was not how it felt. Something, which felt fatal, poured upon him. He was rendered unable to understand anything. In close proximity to him, the courtesan bears, with their claws sharpened right overhead, he could hear their roars. Those claws had swung down, and his cranium had been crushed. Or instead, now, on the edge of his field of vision, which was on the verge of vanishing, that, which had faintly shined, was the one to blame. Despite not knowing which one of the two was the reason, Natsuki Subaru's life came to an end. End of chapters 10 and 11, as if a flash.